Alright, today we're at the De Young Museum to see contemporary Muslim fashion. So, hope you guys like it. We'll see you guys inside. Alright guys, we're looking at the first part of the exhibition was on the actual fashion magazines. Now what you'll really notice, especially contrasted later with some of the actual photos of Muslim women, is the majority are very white. They kind of have that Middle Eastern look, probably between Iran, Syria, Lebanon, maybe Saudi. So that's probably the majority of the Muslim world. But what's curious is they really don't show African Muslims, which is a huge. Alright, so I just looked it up. It's about 60 to 65% of Muslims are white, or similar to European, probably more darker, a little more olive skin, Asian, and 15% are sub-Saharan African, so a really dark African look. So if you look at the actual fashion magazine covers, they're all European, Middle Eastern look. They have only one Asian, so that's probably representative within that magazine trend, probably for Indonesia, Malaysia, Southeast Asia. They have one African American, but that's an American magazine, and all the Middle Eastern magazines are really from the area. They really don't cover sub-Saharan African. So this is pretty interesting. There's a really big skew even within. Some of these magazines are European, so obviously they're going to just use European models. It's way easier. They already have access to them versus flying to Middle East, look up the models, blah, 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 right? So in a way, I get that bias. However, some of the magazines were actually Middle Eastern, and they also have a skew within their own group, skewing towards, white to olive skin, I would say. That's, a good chunk of Muslims, probably 60% are that color range. However, they're totally skipping out sub-Saharan Africans. So you see this big skew. If you also look in other Middle Eastern groups, like say the Jews, they also have this big skew. They don't really show much about sub-Saharan or the Jews from Africa, from Ethiopia. So you have the similar kind of issue. So there is kind of this similar issue with color, and you can really see it from the fashion magazines to the actual later in the presentation. You'll see different groups represented through either rap music or actual street musicians, and you can see it's a whole different look, right? So it has you can see this bias really in the fashion world that exists also as well in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, etc. So now in Southeast Asia, you would expect them to be Asian, so that's fine. In the Middle East, they do have some sub-Saharan Africa, so that probably should be represented. Some of the fashions are really fun. They have from evening gowns to they have a sportswear section where they kind of have some dressed like Nike, and that's kind of where it gets really challenging for Muslim women living in the Middle East. Obviously, not necessarily in the States, the States, their parents are going to be more liberal, but there it's very conservative, so it's very challenging to have sports gear where you're still wearing kind of the hijabs and modest clothing, but doing sports. So like if you're doing fencing, you really need almost very tight fitting clothing, because it's gonna stop you from actually doing your sport. Or if you're running, you can't really run in hijab, or some of these really aggressive sports, it's a real challenge to even be able to do those sports. So that's a real challenge, which they haven't really figured out because of the modesty and the way the clothing is very kind of layered, which is fine for walking around, but for working out, it doesn't work out well. So one of the really cool photos they had was a motorcycle kind of gang, and they're riding around and they have these really fun kind of polka dots and camouflage and everything else to kind of cover up obviously the grease stains from the motorcycles. But it's interesting because some areas of the Middle East, they use motorcycles quite a bit to get around. Southeast Asia is very popular to get around by motorcycle, and some of the countries where they don't have easy access to cars, they probably have a lot of motorbikes. So Iran, not necessarily Saudi Arabia obviously, because they just started driving. So it's one of the really cool exhibitions. It's one of the first traveling exhibitions of contemporary Islamic fashion, which hasn't been done, at least in the West. Maybe it's been done in the Middle East. Obviously, they probably cover their own fashion. But one of the other interesting things was they had one of the queens of, I don't know, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, I don't remember which one. But she was traveling around and doing kind of a PR tour similar to like Queen Elizabeth. She's wearing all these really fancy kind of haute couture within the Muslim style. And it's interesting because you think like, well, that's not realistic. Most women don't have access. But again, you have haute couture in the West. 99.5% of women are never going to wear haute couture. So, you have kind of that same bias where does this really represent what Muslims wear? So fashion is always kind of geared towards, people of at least middle class or higher. So it doesn't really have maybe your average day streetwear. Who wants to look at poor people's clothing, right? I guess you couldn't really make a show about some Levi's and the equivalent of Levi's in the culture, right? It wouldn't be exciting. So the show itself is biased in that way, but it's kind of an art form. So obviously it's going to be the really high end versus the high middle class. There's wedding dresses, of course, which is really interesting. Very amazing jewelry work, embroidery in those dresses. So I think overall, it's a really interesting show to see the Muslim fashion. It was interesting because I was going to show it to my relatives, and they're like, "No, I don't want to see anything from Morocco." And later I heard the backstory, like her daughter dated a Moroccan guy, and she worked with a couple Moroccan, and all of them were bad stories. So, unfortunately, they didn't want to go. Whatever, we took them to the flower garden, right? But anyway, yeah, it was really interesting. My taste is more like Islamic painting, so I'm not. I'm a painter, so I'm going to like Islamic painting. So I'm biased really against going to, say, women's fashion. It's not that I don't have anything against it, it's just I'm a guy. It's like I'd rather see art. So I'm more into architecture, art, and that's my preference. But overall, I think it was a really cool show. To way to improve the show, I would say they could have had more. They had kind of this modern 70s style fashion, which was really cool. I guess that's the way they show it in the Middle East. I'm not sure. It was kind of this weird thing because it had the 70s feel like, in the 70s it was kind of a feel-good pattern where before a lot of the negative imagery of Muslims from terrorism stuff come up in the news as much. So it was probably a more neutral time. So I'm not sure if that was why they used kind of a 70s theme as far as the architecture and stuff. It has a very 70s feel to me at least. And yeah, I think they could improve the show by they would have some Islamic kind of architecture forms where you have the screens where you don't really see in, so you have kind of the shadows, these intricate geometric shapes. I think they could have done that a lot more. That would have gave you a real flavor of the culture itself, because the whole reason why you dress modest is because of the mosque and the religion. So to not have the mosque in part of the section it strips out the whole reason why you dress that way. I think they're trying to present it in a more neutral fashion, per se. It's like it's just a normal thing. We go to the mosque, but we don't have to show the mosque. Yeah, I get that. Another interesting point they had is they had a little part about the French ban on the burkini, which is this really extreme swimsuit that covers everything. It's kind of like what we wore in the 1920s before the bathing starts got smaller and smaller and smaller until you got to the bikini, right? And then you have the microkini, which I don't think most women would wear, but it's a little extreme, right? But anyway, you had this burkini and there was a ban in France, and they're like, we're secular, but we're gonna ban, so it's like, yeah, you're not proselytizing, you're not trying to convert people. You are dressing obviously very Muslim, and it's very well defined. So like if you had 40 women show up in the burkini, it's going to be like, wow, the Muslims are taking over. So I get that a little bit, but to force these women to undress and wear less clothing, to go to the beach, it's like, yeah, I think France is kind of skewing too far. They should probably work on more of an integration type model like melting pot, like the US. So in Europe, they've kind of taken the route where they allow more kind of segregated society. And the first generation usually does live kind of segregated because it kind of balances out. You know, you move to a foreign country, you hang around people you know to kind of get connections and help you sort through the immigration process, how to get a job, all the practical things in life. So that's kind of natural that they form their own communities. But you see them, they haven't really integrated in Europe, and there's a real issue that's kind of boiling under the surface, especially say in France, I would say Belgium as well, and now Germany, where they let them in, they're in their enclaves, you know, the police don't feel safe going in there. It's a little crazy. I mean, a little bit hyped up on the news, so you don't know what's reality, what's not based on the ground. Because I used to live in Europe and it was fine, you know, and they didn't have hyped up news like they do in the States, so you know, the news, unfortunately, the news bias is really extreme, I would say, and they hype up a lot of stuff. So stuff that's not really a controversy, they make a controversy because that's what sells, and they're like, wow, we want to sell newspapers. So yeah, I think a lot of the news is really highly responsible for, you know, hyping up this really negative Muslim attitude, and you know, and they're right to cover things like, say, 9/11 or a bombing or something like that, but that's all they cover. So you really get this feeling like every time you see a Muslim, it's like bombing, right? So it's, you know, the news is really doing a disservice to the Muslim public living abroad, especially within their own culture. It's like whatever, they're, you know, they're in their own culture, they're safe. But if you're in a foreign country, you're the minority, and then they're showing you every time, oh, we don't show this population, and I'll say, boom, a bomb. Oh, look at them. It's a really negative attitude, and obviously with the current administration under Trump, it's gone very negative, I would say. He's been very divisive. Obama was a little divisive as hell, not with the Muslim population. I think he was very neutral because he lived in Indonesia and it's a Muslim country. So he knew how to deal on a world level, and Trump is he's just a jackass. So I don't mean to bring him up, but you know, if you treat people badly in public, it sets a real bad moral standard, and people think it's acceptable to kind of bash on other groups, and that's not where you want to go as a culture. So that's my take. Hope you guys like it. Give me a thumbs up. If you want to subscribe, you can subscribe below, and hope to see you in the next museum critique. Thanks, guys.